right, this is Marty Owings with Minnesota Capital News, and I'm here with Representative Alice Hausman. She is the lead on bonding, really, for the DFL side.
Minority lead.
And so, question for you: we got what, little less than 60 days left in the session, and some people have been saying we're going to wait to deal with the bonding till the end of session. What are your thoughts on that? Where are you at?
Big mistake, big mistake. Writing a bonding bill, particularly a large bonding bill, which I hope it will be, is complicated. And if you do it last minute, you run the risk, one, of running out of time and not getting anything. And that has happened several times, I think. And the other is that you make mistakes. And there are unintended consequences, and that people vote for something that they aren't clear about. So I'm a strong proponent that we look at each of these bills separately, and that we don't allow our leaders to tie everything together into some sort of last-minute deal where they sit in a room and we're not invited in, and we sit outside and wait for them to conclude the deal, where bonding and transportation and taxes are all sort of wrapped up. It's a terrible way to do legislation. I just have always strongly
Let's talk about
that
for a second, because I know that you have been very critical over the lack of transparency, including at one point, getting up off the House floor and just leaving.
Yes.
I remember you got some heat for that, but a lot of people said thank you for standing up for that transparency. What have you heard in regard to any changes as far as transparency?
Well, the problem is, often our leaders make the decisions. And actually, I have to tell you, for our leaders, it's a great deal. They have all the power. Right. And so I think everybody should be saying what I'm saying, that there has to be this kind of a grassroots protest about that. We're all elected to represent our constituents. And if we're not even at the table, if two leaders sit in a room and make the decision, we could save a lot of money. We just have to elect two people. So I just, my caucus knows I have been a broken record about this for a long time. It's a bad habit, a bad way to do legislation.
Well, listen, you had some allies in this area in terms of Paymar and even some Republican colleagues who, were very serious about this kind of transparency. And I don't just want to turn this into a conversation about transparency, but it's so important for the people out there that want to have that happen. Have you found new allies since Paymar left and a few others left?
Well, the dilemma is, believe it or not, most people around here are new. I mean, we have big turnover. As you know, 28 people already are who were here just a year ago aren't going to be here next year. And so I think some people who are new sort of accept this as the status quo, as though this is the way it has to be done or the way it's always been done. And so I think that's why just continuing to describe the problems with it, and that is the public doesn't get to weigh in. They don't get to see a product before. We don't get to see a product before. You may recall the last night of the regular session, people were on their feet. We just flat out had told them they had a bonding bill that they wanted to present last minute, and we basically said we would not be delivering the votes for that.
I remember that. That was controversial. Yeah, and so the people that don't have the sort of long vision of being here like you do, you've been here for a number of years. You've seen a lot of changes. Yes. What do you tell those younger legislators that are coming here?
Well, I think usually I make the argument in caucus, or I make it frequently when I speak to groups. I'm pretty open about this, about my criticism of it, and so I think all you can do is keep talking about it and push to see if we can get some action taken earlier.
Fair enough. So part of that is now you've come up, you've got was it $3.7 billion in requests?
There are probably over $4 billion by now, because they just keep coming in, and that's not unusual. Usually in a year like this, it is roughly $4 billion. There have been more bills written and introduced this year around two things than I've seen before. One is transportation, and the other is very local projects like fire halls and community centers. We can't go there. Anytime you write a bill that is that local, fire halls are all over the state. If we funded one this year, we'd have 200 next year. If we funded a community center this year, we'd have 200 next year. So there are some ways some directions you just can't go. The disturbing thing about the transportation bills is people unwilling to put more transportation revenue on the table, and instead turn to bonding. And that's something we haven't done before.
Little trickery there with little, yeah.
For example, today in Capital Investment, Transportation Alliance was testifying, and they are asking for $200 million in geo-bonding for local roads and $200 million in geo-bonding for local bridges. That's unheard of. We've never done that before. And if you think about it, if we do have the kind of this psychological barrier of $850 million as an absolute top, if 400 of that goes for local roads and bridges, nothing is left. I mean, there's very little left for higher education, University of Minnesota, MnSCU, wastewater infrastructure, corrections, military affairs, veterans, all other agencies. So I've just, again, have spoken out rather strongly. We cannot see geo-bonding as a solution to transportation. One of the arguments I made in committee today is transportation already has the following revenue streams: gas tax, license tabs, motor vehicle sales tax, the county sales tax, property tax, wheelage tax, and federal funding. 7 streams of funding that go to transportation. And now they want to go to geo-bonding. And geo-bonding, general obligation bonding, is the only tool that all other agencies have, including higher education.
They don't have the other mechanisms for revenue.
Streams of funding.
So just to clear this up for the people who don't understand out there, viewers, but this is really unprecedented.
Unprecedented.
Because before, I mean, we pay taxes to take care of the roads and bridges.
Yes.
Now we're talking about taking out loans.
And taking out still and using still another. Now we already take out some loans, but they're trunk highway bonds that are paid for with the gas tax. But this would be geo bonding paid out of the general fund.
So your Republican colleagues would, I think, say our taxes are too high already. We have too many revenue streams coming in for these things. So what, are they on your side in terms of this?
Well, no, they're the ones proposing this. Speaker Doubt said, my caucus won't want to vote for a bonding bill that doesn't have a lot of transportation in it. So he's been setting it up. In fact, I even heard him quoted as saying, of their $800 million bill, 400 would be everything else and 400 would be transportation. So it's coming from them. Now, I think it's because they don't want to raise either the gas tax or the sales tax. So I would make the counter argument. Okay, that's a given. I can understand you don't want to raise taxes. Then use the projected surplus. Use the portion of the surplus that is sort of one-time spending, and use that as a one-time fix for transportation rather than general obligation bonding.
Yeah, I mean, I think the public gets pretty weary, like when we see the education, the shifts and gimmicks that go on there. And now if you're talking about in transportation, now typically we have bonded for big transportation projects, but one way or another, either the taxpayer is going to pay for it up front in the gas tax and other things, or they're going to end up, you say, being on the hook for the loans, for the long-term bonds.
Yes, and
or the short-term bonds.
And the kind of bonding we do, if it's a trunk highway, constitutionally it has to be paid for. A trunk highway bond has to be paid out of the constitutionally dedicated gas tax.
Okay.
It's only local roads and bridges that can be done with geo bonding. So
what's considered, I mean, for us and for people that aren't educated, as far as like trunk highway versus, state or local highway?
State roads versus local. And I mean, you can't really tell by looking at it what it is. But I mean, obviously, some of them. You know that Highway 94 and 694 and 394 and Highway 12 and Highway 14. Some of those are trunk highway. Okay. But it's a little harder to sort out the local roads.
It's like 52. Right. Okay.
Can't tell without a map.
You can't tell, literally. Okay, so apart from the bonding and people wanting to put it off later, and maybe this weirdness with the, what other obstacles do you think you're up against? Is it time is the biggest?
Time. I think, what have we got, 6 weeks left? I think this was a big mistake to start in March. I was actually on my feet when they moved to start in March, but nobody ever debates that, so they didn't even realize I was standing up to debate it. Everything that normally happens from January to May has to happen from March to May. And so everything is compressed. And unfortunately, the part of the process that has been shortened is the part where the public has a chance to weigh in, and that is those committee deadlines were so short. We already had one last Friday.
Right.
And so that kind of thoughtful looking at the bills, having the conversations, and having the public weigh in, that's the part that has been cut short. And the other thing, and this is, the good part of this, we have all these days on the Hill, all these groups. Today we had pharmacists, we had veterinarians, we had, just a AFSCME day. We've had a homeless day on the Hill. I think a week ago we had 30 different groups that were coming to my office in between the meetings and sessions. And so all of those groups that used to visit us from January to May are visiting us in this shorter time. So there's just been sort of an intensity of visits with constituents, which is wonderful. But it's sometimes a little like whiplash, every 15 minutes talking about a different subject.
A new issue.
But it's some of the richest time I have.
Yeah, well, good. And then so we've talked a little bit about some of the challenges here and what we're going through here. Maybe we can just turn to some more personal stuff. Like, could you share something that people might not know about you, Representative Hausman?
Well, of course, the thing we haven't talked about, when you're in infrastructure,
yes.
I started by trying to build a public mass transit system. That's very frustrating because we've sort of, the ideologues who oppose it are again winning, and so we are way behind our competitors. But as I worked with infrastructure, there was one thing I discovered we weren't doing much of, and that was housing infrastructure. And I have to tell you, it's captured my heart like nothing when you recognize the incredible difficulty of those making low wages, even families with children who have jobs, to find affordable housing at the wages they're being paid. And so that has captured my heart. And in 2014, when I was the chair and could write the bill, I was able to write in $100 million. We only took care of 27% of the applicants with that $100 million. That's how great the need is. And 20 million of that is for the traditional housing. But 80 million was where we partner with nonprofits like Lutheran Social Service, Catholic Charities, Common Bond, Beacon, and for every dollar of state money that we do, they generate $3 of private money. They raise a lot of private money. Okay. And the idea is not just to provide shelter for people, but to bring them to a better place in life. And that means we surround them with all of the supportive services. And those nonprofits that we partner with, they have to prove to us that they have the funding for all of those services. And to give you an example of how you can transform lives, I think it's called Skyline Tower on 94 between Hamlin and Lexington. That was a problem property before, and often the children who came from that building were some of the problems in school. And then Common Bond took it over, and they built a building out in front. And in that building, they provided early childhood education and after-school tutoring. And now, 92% of the young people in that building graduate from high school. So if you can provide services right where people live, you can transform lives. And so that has become a cause for me. If you don't have a safe place to sleep at night, nothing else in your life can go very well. And Maslow's hierarchy of human need, that basic security, it even affects children's academic achievement in school. The University of Minnesota did research, and they found that by the time a child reaches 5th grade, if they have been homeless or highly mobile, they achieve at the level of a 2nd grader who has been in stable housing. That's the contribution that housing makes to the academic achievement of children. So
especially here,
I've become, I have to say, just a kind of a missionary on that cause, and now found this year the fastest growing number of people who are homeless is the demographic over 55. Some of them are living on $10,000, $20,000 a year. Finding affordable housing is not possible, and so suddenly and a gentleman who was at one of my press conferences approached me after, said he'd been volunteering at a shelter the night before, and that was the group of people he saw on the line, including a woman with a walker. So can you imagine an older woman using a walker to walk and being homeless? So it's a new motivation. And interestingly, it also solves another problem. You've heard about workforce housing.
Yes.
There was a gentleman from Red Wing who said, if we build, in the city of Red Wing, there are 6,000 people who work in Red Wing but who can't find a place to live there.
Yeah.
If we built senior housing in Red Wing, all of those seniors could move out of their houses into something more appropriate for them, and all of those houses would open up for the workers to be able to afford workforce housing.
Yeah.
So sometimes when you solve one problem, you also have the opportunity to solve another.
Yeah, I think seniors, they struggle with giving up their house because they don't know, you hear these horror stories where people move into senior housing, it's like $3,000 a month, and
Yes.
they spent their whole lives working, they don't want to lose their house, and
Yes.
so I think you're going to have to convince them that's a good deal.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, well, last thing, let's talk a little bit of presidential, because we're in a race right now. There's
Yes.
politics going on. You got Donald Trump and Ted Cruz on one side. You got Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton on the other. Obviously, you're a Democrat. You represent a very diverse area, which is pretty heavily Democratic. They've sent you back here many times.
Yes.
So, but what are you hearing from your constituents in regards to the presidential election and how that's playing out?
Well, I think everyone is discouraged by the tone of hate and anger and division, and I think people just long to get to a better point where we look at the positive aspects of who are we as a state and country, and what is the common good. And so, my fear is that the tone will turn people off. And that they don't vote. And the worst thing is if people get disinterested or disillusioned and don't vote. The nature of a representative form of government can change so quickly based on who goes to the polls to vote. Ultimately, voters decide the nature of our government. So I just hope they don't give up. And it's hard work to find out because there's, the opposition misleads you about the other candidate, and so you have to do a lot of research, get your news from more than one source to try to figure out what are they really standing for, what have they done in their life, what are their capabilities. I mean, this is the leader of the free world. We use that phrase a lot. So hopefully by November we have chosen the right person.
Yeah, and I think you're referring to the rhetoric from the Trump campaign. And
well, there's a little bit of it in the Democratic side, too.
Yeah, okay.
Fair
enough.
It's when you tear down rather than build up. The Icelandic Women's Party, they have as a just a basic premise of who they are, to never define the other person. Let that other person define themselves. They only in their campaign define themselves. And I long for that.
I don't know if that's going to happen in America, but there seems to be a lot of support at least for Donald Trump's campaign among the base. Does this discourage you in terms of
It's very
Democrat?
confusing to know. I mean, everyone thought each of those things he said, like I could go out in the street and shoot someone and people wouldn't leave my campaign. And you just hear this and you just can't even believe this is happening. So I don't think we begin to understand yet who are these people who have rallied around him with such fervor that they wouldn't leave him for anything. And I think we have a lot of work to do yet to figure out how did someone like this, who came out of reality TV, become this popular with such a segment. Now, I don't think he's ultimately going to be the candidate. It looks as though the Republican Party is so resolved that can't happen. I don't know what their path is going to be to avoid that, but it certainly seems as though there's a strong desire to avoid that. But it's hard to believe that in the United States of America, we've come to this, and other countries look at us in disbelief and fear. I mean, they know that there's a lot at stake for them. We've got to have a stable country.
Fair enough. And on your side of the ticket, Hillary and Bernie, which of those two candidates have you come out and said you were going to support?
I'm actually supporting Hillary Clinton, and I am one of those people who...
you just disappointed your entire under 30
yes, I did.
population.
But here's the thing for me. I long to see someone of my gender as President of the United States. Now, if there weren't a capable person, absolutely that wouldn't be my highest priority. But I believe President Obama, who said she's wicked smart and she is the most prepared non-vice presidential candidate ever to run for president. That was his summary. And so, I do believe that she, with her experience, is best prepared, and her whole life she has fought for progressive issues in the common good, starting with the Children's Defense Fund.
Very good. Anything else you want to touch on before we wrap up here, Representative Hausman?
So many things, but another conversation.
Sure. All right. Thank you. This is appreciate your time tonight, and as always. All right. This has been Marty Owings with Representative Alice Hausman, live from the Capitol.